Andrew, good evening. Let me say very, very nice to see you, of course, through video. How are you?
Well, I think you know, a lot of my friends know that I had a very bad experience. I came into contact for a prolonged period of time with somebody who later that night got the virus. And then I had the unpleasant experience of counting the days, because you have to get to 14 days without symptoms, or maybe one has it without symptoms, but mostly you're counting. You know, there are two groups of people who count the days. One is prisoners, and the other are people waiting for the infection to become real in them. It left me with great energy, and energy to think about the future, energy to think about possibilities, but not energy, by the way, to get all excited about how wonderful this virus is, and isn't it great that dolphins swim in Venice, and look at all that poetry and all those images and all that happiness. To me, this is something I find so difficult. Maybe it's my personality, Stefano, but I can't get involved in all this optimism and positivistic. I can think and I can see a future and I can hope, but I cannot join in this Panglossian excess. For those people watching this, Dr. Pangloss was the tutor of Voltaire's Candide, who, when he saw the colossal Lisbon earthquake, refused to accept it was a bad thing and said everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. So, to me, one of the main enemies of a satisfactory reconstruction is sentimentalism. That's how I am personally, but I hope we don't just stick to me and my personal situation. But I've had so much good wishes. It's very nice.
Going beyond sentimentalism, does this crisis, does the coronavirus tell us something about the limits of psychology?
I'm really glad you asked this. I mean, I am an enthusiast for psychology in relation to social and political problems. I spent my career developing ways that can be operationalized. But I'm also a skeptic. I have a tragic vision about psychology and politics. There are really serious limits. What I like to see is alliances between the psychological communities and other people who are politically active, who have radical and progressive views, who have a commitment to change and transformation. So psychology on its own, get it. But an approach to our current crisis without psychology at all, forget it. We have to find a balance. We have to find people to relate to, if I may say something a little flippant. We have to find people to play with. We are playing too much with one another, swapping Jungian theories, swapping quotes, swapping references. Come on. This esotericism, this group introversion must stop. We have to reach out. And actually, you and the guys you are with in Italy, who was the first in Europe to set up a project of a collaboration between therapists and frontline medical people, health people, doctors, nurses, paramedics. This is also an alliance, a partnership. This is psychosocial. This is something in action done by analysts like yourself and others. I'm deeply, deeply moved and impressed, because it is not just psychology.
And what really touched my heart, and here I have to thank many other people like Maria Giovanna Bianchi, Alessandra Di Montezemolo, Monica Lucci, who you know very well, Eva Pattis Zoya, who you also know very well, Chiara Tozzi, Roberto Grande, and Antonio Lanfranchi, who is on the front line. Well, this is the group we started this initiative with. And
let me do this.
Yeah. But also to clap hands for those 100, I think today we are around 130 volunteers, psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychotherapists who volunteer and said, I want to give psychological support for free to those in the front line. I think this is amazing. This is such a generative thing, and we need this in Italy. But let me ask you another question.
Can I interrupt?
Of course.
I want to say something that I already wrote on a psychoanalytic listserv, a relational psychoanalytic listserv. This experience shows us that therapy has to change. First of all, the psychoanalytic shibboleths and rituals have to be interrogated even more. Second, the role of the client or the patient, whatever you want to call them, this becomes more and more important compared to the role of the therapist or the analyst or the doctor or something like this. Later in our discussion, I'm going to say we cannot go back to the normal. We cannot go back to business as usual, but that applies to psychotherapy too.
Another important point is what's going on around the world, racism. Ulrich Beck many years ago said that every crisis is a cosmopolitan crisis. We are all vulnerable, we are all responsible. What does the coronavirus tell us about racism?
Well, I'll make a simple response and then a slightly more complicated response, because I'm supposed to be a professor and therefore be complicated. The simple response is that people of a progressive inclination have to stand up against the racism, especially in connection with China. And I remember when people started talking about the Chinese virus in London, together with some friends, we started to eat only in Chinese restaurants. Crazy, but anyway, that's what we did. I don't have much original stuff to say about this, but in the end, the attempt to deflect blame and indeed anxiety onto the other, onto another group, is a very well tested way that authoritarian leaders function, and we need to speak against it. The more complex thing concerns Ulrich Beck. Now, you know more about Beck than I do, but the concept of risk, which I'm going to talk about, I hope, towards the end of our conversation, is really important, because what he said was, you can't control it. Governments cannot control it, technology cannot control it, having a powerful religious faith cannot control it. I mean, he was also talking at one point about what we call in England mad cow disease, some kind of brain disorder that comes from cows, cattle. And this has always been inspirational to me as I work out my ideas about the good enough leader, the one who knows that they will fail and whose job is to become a master or mistress of failure. Beck is an absolute inspiration in this. You cannot control modern and postmodern societies. Maybe you can never control any societies. There's a kind of organic madness that moves in societies, and I think Beck was the first one to place risk at the heart of the improbability of governance. You cannot govern. And I think, I don't know if I've summarized him correctly, but that's my Beck.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is linked to the fact, compensation from what Beck says is the opposite. We are all in this together, cosmopolitanism, but we are not all in this together, even in the therapies.
Well, I can only focus on the therapy situation because I've been writing so much about it. I hear from Western analysts, all my practice is online. All my practice is online. Probably your practice is all online. What happens if you don't have such a practice? If you don't have apparently you don't, to have a comfortable practice and everybody can give each other stories about how they're working in their basement and how interesting it is to see inside other people's houses and other people's pussycats walk across the computer. And oh, fuck it, man. It is not like that if you are working in Africa. My friend and colleague in Cape Town, Sally Swartz, has written beautifully about this. It's not like it if you're working with refugees. There are 8.7 million refugees in the world. First, they're not going to get a great deal of therapy. They get some. But secondly, they are not in it together with people in Hampstead, Manhattan, San Francisco, Berlin, all of whom post about how they've moved to their second houses in the mountains, houses on the beach, houses, I don't know, cottages, houses, whatever. This is so insensitive. I am I am quietly recuperating with my family in my wife's parents' second home on the coast in name a place. I mean the insensitivity.
With a piano.
Oh, with a fucking piano. And then people are saying, and I have a client with this, the local people are saying, get the fuck out, go away. Sorry to swear so much, but this inequality is intolerable. And this is what I mean when I say therapy has to change. We really have to address who we are, what our social location is, and how that will change after this. It will change. And by the way, at the moment, well-off privileged analysts like me have got more or less the same practice we always had. Is that going to last for 6 months? No. The practices will decline in quantity. The shrieks of financial anxiety and panic from the privileged, not of course just therapists, will get louder and louder and louder. This is the revolution that the rich, the very rich, escape, but the upper middle class and the middle class, they're not.
You mentioned it before. What do you mean that the future means no return to normality?
Yes. People say when we get back to normal, okay, everybody understands what that means. Jung had a great line about normality. He said, show me a normal person and I'll cure him for you. And Christopher Bolas writes about the normotic personality. Personality, someone is just too normal, too adapted. Actually, Jung writes about this too. Anyway, we cannot get back to normality in terms of the climate crisis. We cannot get back to normality in terms of international relations, economic inequality, whether it's on the international or national or even communal level. We cannot go back to that. Personally, I don't talk the language of how we are all going to be solidarity and work together, and there will be an end of individualism, and Ubuntu will suddenly come in and change the West. Come on, it's just not going to be like that. If we want to avoid the vicissitudes of normality, we will have to struggle. This is not going to happen easily. The powerful will return unless the less powerful do something about it. And here there is a role for therapists, along with other radical and progressive forces to say absolutely clearly no return to normality. But there will be a struggle. There will be a huge political struggle. I'm often talking with people I know in the climate crisis world, Extinction Rebellion, and so on, and they get this. There is a potential for transformation, but it's up to us.
I want to use the end of a movie. Perhaps you know it, perhaps not. It's called Mediterraneo by Gabriele Salvatore. It won the Oscar for Best Foreign Movie in the early 90s. And it was about soldiers sent to Greece to fight Second World War. They were sent to fight a war they never fought. And at the end of the war, they were so happy, excited to go back home to Italy. And they used to say, we have to go home because it's a new time. We have to rebuild Italy. We can create a new Italy. Then the last scene is 40 years after. The same men are around 70 years old. So something must have gone wrong, and they look at each other in the same island where they spent the war, and they say, well, we went back, we wanted to rebuild Italy, but we were not allowed.
Yes, yes, this is right. You win the war and you lose the peace, is the British expression of this. After the First World War, the idea was to create a land fit for heroes. It didn't happen. Look at the 1920s. Look at the Great Depression, which affected the whole world. You know, we talk a lot now about the 1918, 1919 Spanish flu, which is also a racist point, but anyway, we do. And we don't talk much about the Great Depression. Do you know, I have been reading, I must say, left-wing economists who are talking about unemployment rates. In America could be more than 20%, in Britain 17 or 18%. Oh. This is a Great Depression. That is what we should be reading, not only the influenza epidemic. There is going to be a terrible economic reckoning, especially I would focus it in my mind around unemployment, because one of the issues is that even if an unemployed person is receiving some small financial subsidy from the state, they are still experiencing the destruction of soul that unemployment brings. But let me just qualify that. Of course, a lot of jobs are awful jobs. Yeah. So it doesn't look as if unemployment is terrible, but there is something that I could call the dignity of work, and the dignity of work has gone. And if the dignity of work goes, then fraternity and sorority, they go too.
This is a big threat. And I see many people, few patients saying, yeah, but I'm working from home, but business as usual. Well, I think this is their compensation to the anxiety, even angst and panic. That is not going to be business as usual for a long, long time. But let me ask you one last question. Hopes and also risks of this situation.
Before we can talk about hope, we have to talk about obstacles to it. Obstacles within ourselves as individuals and within our culture, within our societies. We are facing an apocalypse. The hard thing for me to say is that a lot of people want it. This is now speaking as a therapist, actually. There is an unconscious pull or attraction towards apocalypse. Why? I think the masochistic tendency in the human psyche, which Freud put first before sadism, the masochistic tendency searches for reasons to be punished. And when you are faced with something like this, or actually previously climate crisis, there is an attraction. I call it apocalypticism. Apocalypticism is a stupid word, but it's clear that it is an obstacle to any kind of hope. That's the first thing I want to say. With regard to hope, you know, I've written a lot about this. There are different categories of hope. The first category of hope, it comes from the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian. You know the one about Jesus, this film? No, it's okay. Well, I didn't know. I'm telling you about a film you didn't know. It's a kind of comedy about a guy called Brian, who obviously represents Jesus, and it's incredibly satirical. So at the end of this film, Jesus and many, many other people are on the cross, and they start to sing, "Always look on the bright side of life. Da-do, 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 da-do. Always look on the bright side of life." That shallow hope, it works for a while. I can't mock or dismiss anyone who wants to look on the bright side of life, but that's not hope, as I want to talk about it in the last few minutes of our conversation. For me, hope springs from taking risks. Examples of hope depend on somebody taking a risk. The one I'm always talking about and thinking about, and more in these terrible days, is Jan Palach, the young Czech guy who put gasoline on him and lit a match, and you can see the pictures of it. Of course, self-immolation has a long history. It's a martyrdom, but this was political. And I think there's many other examples of how hope and risk go together. When paramedics in Gaza run towards the fence and are shot as they run to do their job, dressed in their uniforms, they are taking a huge risk, and out of such behavior comes any kind of authentic hope. But it's not always violent. Sometimes people take a huge risk in communicating across a divide, enemies, talking to one another, people who have perhaps on both sides of a conflict. For example, in Northern Ireland, they lost people in their families. It's a huge risk to talk to and possibly forgive the killer of your child or your brother or something like this. Hope needs to be based on risk. And I think in our generation right now, the possibility of constructing a genuine hope on the basis of risk exists. Who is going to do it? You. The younger people are going to do it. I am what they call a baby boomer. I was born in 1949. I've had a fantastic life. I've done absolutely what I've wanted. I broke a lot of rules. I had a lot of fun. It's okay. I don't really care. When I was facing the possibility that I would get this virus because of my prolonged contact with somebody, it made me think, is it okay to go, to die? And I wrote this in several places. Everyone was very surprised because it's not my normal style to write in this kind of way. Maybe I'm being sentimental, even though I don't want to be sentimental. And I thought, okay, I really, really don't want to die, but I don't mind. Your generation, you are 40, 41, something like this. This is your moment. You didn't have a war, not a big war. There are little mini wars. The Vietnam War doesn't count. Your age group, down to 30 to 40, you didn't have a war. My generation didn't have a war, but you've got one now, brother. Because when this, I think I've heard you say this. In fact, I think I'm stealing your idea, which probably I've done many times, Stefano, okay? Over the years we've known each other. But who is going to be responsible for rebuilding the countries of the world? I can't imagine the United States can rebuild when both the presidential candidates are 77 or 78. Where are the younger people? Is the idea that we elect older people because they're safe, they have a reliable demeanor or something like this, or is it just normal to do it? Of course, not all countries have old leaders, okay, but an awful lot do. So it is. It's really your war. I mean, I'll help, but it's your war.
Time of risk and time of courage. I totally agree.
Courage. Can I interrupt as usual?
Yeah.
Winston Churchill, who I don't like, but who has been on my mind, said, courage is the virtue that guarantees all the other virtues. And those people listening to this should Google what Martin Luther King and Maya Angelou said about courage. I'm very glad you brought the word in because it's what we need.
It's what we need, and perhaps it's what our generation needs to learn. My generation needs to learn, because we've been giving a lot from our parents, from you, those in your age. My parents are more or less your age. And also it's time of being or becoming generative, to have the courage to put something into the world, to let it grow and let it go. Otherwise, it will be a big mess. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. That was a very, very interesting conversation, and I felt my heart rate go up in the conversation, which for me is a good sign, because for me, to be bored is the worst death.
Yeah, and hopefully many people will watch it and ponder on it, reflect, and take action. Thank you.
Let's see.